We're going to talk about John Souttar. We talk about one player that's had injury problems, Ryan Porteous. I think John Souttar maybe kind of says, I don't know, my injuries are all worse. He's just had a bit of a nightmare. He's only played 7 games this season, so he had ankle surgery at the start. He's now ruptured his Achilles tendon, which is a bit of a long-term injury as well. So I think the thing is, he looked like he had a good thing going with Craig Halkett for about 2 or 3 games, and you thought that's the kind of pairing that really could help turn it around for Hearts and Stendhal. They did subsequently go on to lose 3-2 to Kelly and 5-0 to Celtic with those two playing in defence, but there was kind of glimmers of hope of them kind of building that partnership, and I do feel he is 23 and it's going to be really hard for him to bounce back from these injuries, but I do feel like he 100% has to be in this list. He's a huge prospect, not just for Hearts, but for Scotland. You really hope he's going to get back to his best. Stefan, in terms of Hearts, how much has their kind of struggles been down to him not being consistently fit?
Yeah, I think probably more so than most players who'll be on this list, John Souttar's on here basically just because of the promise he still holds. He's kind of almost in a similar kind of group as Porteous. I just kind of put him slightly ahead of Porteous just in terms of his progress and what he's shown to date. His injuries have been really bizarre, actually. I remember listening to an interview with Craig Levein when he was still the manager, trying to explain why Souttar was still out injured, and he basically alluded to the fact that Hearts went to maybe 4 or 5 different specialists to really try and figure out what was going on with his ankle. And it wasn't until they basically took him to Switzerland or something like that, and the guy basically, for lack of a better term, opened up Souttar's ankle, as in literally a bit of surgery to have a poke around, and they figured out that it was something entirely different from what the first 3 doctors thought it was. So he's obviously just got this hugely unfortunate and very specific situation right now where he has to basically get over it. But if you kind of put those injury concerns to one side, I think it's still worth pointing out that when he is playing and when he is doing well, he undoubtedly, in my opinion, looks like one of the most promising defenders in the league. For example, just this season, he was averaging 8.84 interceptions per 90, which is just outstanding for a centre-back. His passes into the final third, again, quite like Porteous, again, show an outstanding ability from a young defender with technical ability, and he's actually top for young centre-backs in the division for passes into the final third. And I think him and Porteous actually remind me of one another in the sense that they both do look like these almost kind of accomplished central defenders that, at least for me growing up, is something that Scotland just never really seemed to have. We had kind of physical central defenders and we kind of had angry central defenders, but we never really seemed to have these kind of continental, technically gifted central defenders. And we now have these guys kind of coming through, and I think Souttar kind of best represents that. And if he can kind of get back to full fitness, and maybe this kind of lockdown or the suspension of football for the foreseeable future might actually help him in that regard. If he can kind of come back next season and kind of put his injuries behind him, I think we're undoubtedly looking at a player who would be knocking on the door for a Scotland national team before very long. I think Scotland are crying out for him, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And if he can keep fit, I think he's one of the best central defenders in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the point as well about his kind of skill set, that kind of pressing by Stendhal and the line being higher, and you're having to kind of risk maybe defending facing towards your own goal. I think that's what he's really good at, and like you mentioned his interception rate, I think that's what Souttar's very good at, getting back and making tackles or making interceptions when their backs are against the wall or people have kind of gotten over the top of them. And I think if they had him fit going into kind of Stendhal's tenure, I believe they would be in a bit of a better position. I suppose you can maybe say the same to an extent for Craig Halkett as well, but I guess the point I would want to ask you, James, is the only worry for me as a Hearts fan would be if things go a certain way, would he still be there next season?
I mean, I would expect him probably to remain there. I think just purely because of his problems with injury. I don't know if many teams would, pay the money to take him away from Hearts, given his injury record at the moment. I mean, you know, throughout his career, I mean, you need to remember as well, he broke into the Dundee United team when he was 16, so this is effectively his, what, 6th, 7th season playing football, even though he's only 23, which is incredible. But, I mean, when you sort of tot up all the bad injuries he's had over the course of his career, it works out essentially that he's missed 2 years in terms of time out with injury, which is, you know, it's an enormous amount of time. So I think it really is just about whether or not they can get to the bottom of this sort of, you know, the ankle and I think it's the Achilles tendon as well. Like, now that seems to be the real issue that keeps recurring, and that's something that if he's going to really kick on, that needs to be resolved. Now, I think in terms of his actual ability, I think he's a fantastic young defender. I think, you know, athletically, he's incredible. I think, like Stefan mentioned, technically as well, he's actually very good for the position that he plays. Like you said, I think part of the reason why his interceptions are so high is because of the role that he plays in the team. When he was alongside Berra, Berra was sort of like, you know, the holding defender, where it was Souttar who would sort of go forward and, you know, attempt to tackle and attempt to intercept the ball. And I think that under Stendel, that role is quite similar. So I'd expect, you know, things like his interceptions will be high, but for instance, his defensive duel success rate will be low, because I think it's sitting at around about 50% this season, which is not great. But then you need to remember that it's because he's rushing out and trying to win tackles that maybe, you know, he's less likely to win. So that maybe sort of compensates for that. But certainly I think that, you know, when he's fit and firing, I mean, I'd have him in the Scotland team, definitely, without a shadow of a doubt. It's just all about maintaining that level of fitness and, you know, staying injury free for him. That's the biggest thing for him, because he does show so much promise. I know he always has, and now it's just about keeping fit and, you know, just playing consistently. You know, that's what he needs, and the only way to do that is to stay fit and to somehow resolve this recurring injury problem.
Is it a slight blessing in disguise, Stefan, that we do have this lockdown, because maybe will give him this prolonged period of time to try and get back to fitness for the start of next season, whenever that is?
Yeah, I think so. And all I'll maybe add to that as well before we move on is just that we in the modern game, there's always this kind of fear that players will burn out if they play too much too quickly. You know, Michael Owen's maybe the most famous example of that. He's not even modern anymore. It's showing how old I'm getting. But I think Souttar, and I'm desperately trying to think in my head who I'm thinking of, but there are examples of players who the kind of first steps of their career are kind of dogged by injuries, but then when they kind of get into their mid-20s, they kind of finally get over them because they dealt with injuries properly when they had to, and they can kind of enjoy the rest of their career relatively injury-free. And I'm really hopeful that Souttar's that kind of player, because at 23, if I'm not mistaken, he's still a player who has, you know, even if he was maybe to get back on his feet and start playing next season, he's still got at least 10 years before he really has to start worrying about things in terms at a Premiership level. So if he can put these injuries behind him, there's so much time for him to kind of crack on with things. And if he's dealt with these injuries properly and really taken his time out, then there's no reason why he can't. So I think, as James correctly points out, he's missed a lot of football over the last 6 or 7 seasons, but there's still plenty more to play for.